My name's Byron Flecky. I'm Statly. I'm from Hocklip, which is a little ways up the river from where I am today. I'm a guest here on what I call occupied Kwantlen territory. It's their traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands. Some people know it as Langley, but to give an idea of how long I have been here and we've been here and they have been here to keep with the theme of the talk, um, when the ice started to recede 8 to 10,000 years ago in this area, it carved out what we know as the Fraser Valley and the surrounding mountain ranges, and uh, human human settlement had been discovered at that time as soon as it had gone away, and so they have been living with the land for at least that long, as opposed to me living on their land for a handful of years, and for the city and the township, the province and the country being here for a relatively short amount of time in comparison. The interview you're about to hear is with Dr. Tero Mustonen, and we had originally planned to record a 15 to 20-minute soundbite, getting some ideas and reflections from Tero on the topic of Indigenous peoples and climate change. Um, Things didn't go as planned, and so we had an hour and 10-minute dialogue discussion, and so we thought it was worthwhile to share that with people and give people access to that. And so what you're about to hear is the 1 hour long, 15-minute soundbite that we recorded with Dr. Tero Mustonen. Please enjoy.
Hello, Byron and dear colleagues. My name is Tero Mustonen, and I'm living in a small village of Selkie in North Karelia, Finland. So I'm tuning in from the boreal north to you, not unlike the Canadian landscapes, because of course Canada is another boreal country. And let me also offer my grievances on the recent victory that you had over Finland on ice hockey last Sunday. But let's bury the past behind us and try to come to a place of peace. I work for an organization called Snow Change, and Snow Change is a network of local traditional and indigenous villages all across the north. And it's a non-profit organization registered in Finland. I'm currently serving as the chairperson. I'm the fourth chairperson over the past 20 years. And I'm a Finn myself, and our village has the status of a traditional community in Finland. But many people in Canada know also about our linguistic cousins, the Sami, who are by constitution the indigenous peoples of Finland. Why do we exist is to try to find community and indigenous knowledge relevant solutions to climate change. The Arctic is being hit heavily by climate change impacts in many fronts. We are all cryosphere societies, meaning that snow and ice are really at the center of our culture, languages, and ways of life. And now that everything's shifting up here because of the warming, we have tried to come up with, over the past 20 years, come up with relief programs, support for community-led restoration and rewilding, and small grants programs, scientific understanding of climate change, and so on, to cope with what's underway. Lastly, to say that personally, I'm a fisherman, and I also have a science training. I'm a geographer, and I'm servicing in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, as a lead author with the mandate for the Europe and polar regions. So I'm responsible for the northern parts and Antarctic questions at the moment in the latest assessment. And great to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Okay, thank you. That was excellent. I'll I have a couple questions, but I'll begin with my blurb first, and then we'll carry on. Um, let's see here. if I can, I don't know if there we go. Now I'm spotlighted, I guess. I'll just drag this over my screen. So, people, place, and time. That's in the title of this episode. And I think these three things might help frame a conversation on climate and Indigenous perspectives. And I think this because these three things are perhaps the core of our reality. John Trudell, when explaining that we are the human beings, said that the bone, flesh, and blood, the DNA of the human, the bone, flesh, and blood is literally made up of the metals, minerals, and liquids of the earth. So we are parts of the earth, shapes of the earth, forms of the earth. He said that that's the reality. Nothing will ever change that reality. But what does change and can be changed, sometimes by force, is our perception of that reality. He phrased it as our perceptual relationship to reality. So, how do we perceive our shared reality? And how does that perception relate to climate or our understanding of climate? And how does that perception allow us to contribute to or influence climate? People, place, and time. Something this has me thinking of, which is also from John Trudell, is that we all have tribal roots. We all come from a tribal past. And I think those tribal roots have a lot more in common with each other than we have in common today. The things we have in common around the world today are, I think, more likely related to colonial expansions and imperial ambitions of one flavor or another. So they are forced or coerced similarities. Now that's a simplification, but I'm going to run with it. I think the further we get from those tribal roots, from that understanding of our relationship to the earth, the more potential we have for disastrous human-made or human-contributed changes in climate. This is not to say that all things related to the climate are 100% the fault of humans. I don't think we're that powerful, but I think there's an awful lot we can control. And once we know better, we should be doing better, unless we are a long way or a long time from our tribal roots. So with people, place, and time in mind, I think it's worth exploring, or at least to momentarily think about how memory fits into this reality. Let's consider something like social amnesia. What do we know about our current place in time? And what do we know about the people in it? It's easy to forget our reality when recent perceptions are dressed up in things like progress. Although at times things seem a little too backwards for me to call them progress, that doesn't stop the argument and the word from being used regularly, but it does help with the forgetting. When you get to control the language, you can control the perception of reality. That being said, I think the bond between people and place over time is too strong to be forgotten that easily. That is why Trudell talks about how the people who came over here on a boat had experienced 400 years of this forced perception change. When Trudell says that Columbus was a virus, he means Columbus brought over a perception of reality that was forced on the tribes of Europe, and the disease feeds on the human spirit. So that concept, that understanding of us as the human beings in our shape or form of the earth was not a part of their worldview anymore. That change was happening for the 20th generation by the time Columbus got here. That change was required to suppress our memories so that progress can take place. And this progress essentially serves what Trudell called the industrial ruling class or the ethnic rich minority, and what Chomsky would call the people who rule the world. So we have this motivated forgetting, and it's motivated in the most crucial manner possible for human beings, and that's through survival. We have a survival-based amnesia. And who can blame anyone for participating in that forgetting? But I don't think it worked, and I think not only are Indigenous peoples' continued existence an example of that, but I think in the Western civilized world, there are little indicators that the suppressed perception of reality exists, and in those forgotten places of our minds is the true key to our survival as a species. I like to joke with my white friends when they get all outdoorsy. I call it cute, and I say, "She's calling you back, you just don't realize it." Sometimes people will say, sometimes people will say it's good for them. They feel better. They get fresh air, exercise. It isn't like being in the city. The list goes on and on and on. And all I can do is say, yes, that's what I said. With people in place and time in mind, I'll get out of the way and turn it over to our guests. So, Tero, do you have any reflections, thoughts, responses, reactions to anything I've mentioned?
It's just so different, and the way history went in different places, and it takes so much effort to think you can't speak your own language. So I think we are blessed in that sense, despite the ecological damage that has happened in Finland, that our post-ice age language is still here, and it's often been cited as being one of the hunter-gatherer languages of northeastern Eurasia. So there's this group of languages called Finno-Ugric peoples, the Sami, the Komi, Hanti, Finns, Estonians. My takeaway from that reflection is that the sense of reality is being dictated, and also the sense of time and the past, present, and those futures to come that are trapped in that line of progress. The second thing that came to my mind was the necessities of social change in places like Canada. You are one of the strongest in the world in terms of a public society, by respecting multiple viewpoints, by bringing critical voices, discourses, narratives, and so on and so on. You believe that change will happen. I'm rather skeptical. I think that sometimes that is it too late? Is the damage is too big? For example, if the conceptualization of time and space can't happen using literally, let me put it other way, in ways that are fluent in indigenous languages. And this is, of course, not a way to ignore the damage to the indigenous societies. The damage is horrible, and it's a catastrophe that so many of the languages are either critically endangered or have already died out. But it's still there, that only by fluently knowing the language and the deeper layers of the mind that's embedded in a boreal or northern linguistic reality and social reality, you can come to the nuances. And those are really the key in many places here on how we call, for example, certain fish or certain fish that might predict things to come, have their specific names and cultural indicators, and if I start to explain them in English, they might be descriptive and to the point, and they might describe the northern pike that's really specific, or we can use her liver to predict the seasonal weather, but it doesn't really convey the how things are. It will describe it, but it doesn't convey the essential word that we use for that liver or northern pike or the fish. And that's the double loss, double disassociation that came to my mind. That how do you undo that? Of course, the healing and the rebuilding starts what you said, which is that we name how things are, we name the colonial attack and the genocide and so on. But are we in a place, or traditional societies and indigenous peoples, the work to be done to come to a place of rebuilding those cultural realities is immense. It's only a handful of places in the world where I have ever seen it succeeding. And we should be aware of that challenge. That's some of the thoughts that came to me.
That was really beautiful. I think the nuances and the language, kind of what we actually lose in translation, is a pretty important topic, especially as it relates to climate and our understanding of it and our relationship to it. Something you mentioned, I had an outro question planned, which I'll jump to now because you sort of brought it up with your skepticism, is that one of my favorite short novels is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And in it, he's fighting these vampires. and they've taken over the world, and a new sort of hybrid species arises, and he's the last of the regular human beings, and he's been sort of laying waste to the vampires while they've been trying to come for him. And at the very end, you know, they've somebody's tried to help him by getting him to escape, and he refuses to leave his home, and that's sort of what does him in. Is his paranoia and his refusal to leave his home. The stubbornness, the same kind of stubbornness that human beings are really good at having. And in the sort of closing moments, as he's on his way to his very public execution, he realizes that he's a part of the old ways, and he is legend now. And so some of the things I wonder when we look at what we've done to the planet and each other is it too late? Are we just Robert Neville sitting alone in our house refusing to leave as the new world sort of peeks around the corner? And then should we just, similar to, I guess, Socrates, take our medicine and then become the stuff of the legends of the future? And maybe there's a new human species that will come out of our coming sort of climate catastrophes. So that's one of my sort of negative ones where I would throw it out as a challenge, and maybe ask if if you think there's any I guess first of all if there's any hope, but also if humans deserve to continue on or just become legend. And I think I'm not pessimistic. I just put it out to highlight sort of to highlight or motivate why people should seriously consider some of these topics. And so, you have any thoughts on taking our medicine and moving on, or continuing to fight the good fight, so to speak?
Well, the if there is a fight and if there are things to be done, they should be based on the utmost and sugared sense of reality to the extent we can. So the first thing we should admit, whether it's Canada or Finland, is that how much and how deep the damages go. Nothing can happen before we have that self-reflection and say that if I think of, for example, our case, 90% of the primary boreal forest in Finland over the past 75 years has been handed over to the timber industries and the pulp mills, much like most of boreal Canada. The difficulty with what you are describing and what's so central to the First Nations and Inuit struggles in Canada are these rhetorical expressions on indigenous knowledge and associated rights and rebuilding and so on and so on. The difficulty with those things in any culture, whether it's Bangladesh or Finland or Canada, is that, for example, in our case, the thoughts and the deep things that exist in any culture or as a basis core of any culture can only be found in the undisturbed or natural systems. In our case, of course, the boreal forest. This would be the home, the source, the center of all of our creativity, our own names for the stars, our name for the fishing gear, or how a woman might think about their life, or a painter might do whatever they do. Or we used to have these birch bark dances, or dances associated with birch bark masks at the time of the old religion, to honor some of the forest beings and so on and so on. Now, what I'm trying to say is that if you remove those central 90% elements of that reality by clear cutting those forests and ditching peatlands and altering river systems that are interconnected with the forest, you are clear cutting the mind. And therefore, our starting point, if in our case, if we have lost over 90% of our boreal forests in Finland, it implies that we have then lost over 95% of our so-called traditional mind. And the generation who is alive today, for example, myself, born in 1970s, can hope to grasp or come to an understanding of, in my lifetime, at its best, about 3 to 5% of what reality consisted of to the old people. And that's our starting point. How do you rebuild from that 3% when you know that 100 years ago or 200 years ago in our region, for example, in North Karelia, there was a whole boreal civilization of unbroken epic songs, oral histories that were then documented by Lönnrot and used by Tolkien, for example, as the basis of the Elven languages in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I once gave a keynote at University of Leeds, and where Tolkien had been a professor before the time at Oxford, and I jokingly started by saying that I'm here to collect some royalties because you took our songs and so on and so on. They didn't find it too funny, but in any case, the point being is that we know the past existed. We know that the traditional society was genuine. It wasn't some noble savage or fairy tale society. It was a human society. There was a lot of trouble, a lot of bad times, misuse of this and that. It was a human society. But one of your Inuit filmmakers, Elizabeth Illepi, has said very beautifully about the past of any traditional society that the difference between today and the past is that it was their time. They were in the position of making that justice system, or making a call when to go hunting, or they decided when they get married, or when they expel a person, or so on and so on. And today that reality is controlled by invisible and visible forces in a degraded landscape of those 3% of natural ecosystems remaining. And that's in a way the strategic starting point when you talk about cultural revitalization. So try to answer in summary, very short, to your very important question. I think we will become new. There's no going back to anything that used to be 200 years ago. We have to embrace the fact that the landscapes are now different. We have to embrace that a lot of indigenous and traditional communities are operating in many cases in English or in a degraded capacity to maintain their languages. But there is still things to be done to be free. So the concept of freedom is still there. And no matter how many residential schools or prisons or genocides have happened, if there's a people, they can still be free. And that's what we should be striving for. So there are still universal forces, for the lack of better term, the seen and the unseen, which have never left us. They are still here, despite the fact that the attack on the mind in traditional societies has been so severe by the colonial forces. Sometimes we become the enemy, like the Finns. We can self-colonize. We can become our own worst enemy. It doesn't always have to be the Soviets or the Canada or the US. It's us. Let's start from that. What happened with my father or their grandparents? So we can also be in a position of self-harm by having thrown down the values and senses of reality in the past generations, and also the abuse, alcoholism, and suicide, and whatever the case, because we chose to. We don't often like to talk about this, but this is also the case, that there's a tremendous damages that have taken place because men mostly have embraced really bad ideas and practices. Maybe some of the ladies had it better, but they are now paying the price of our mistakes. But to cut the rambles short, I think the rebuilding really has to go hand in hand with nurturing large-scale ecosystems back into health. At least that's the only solution that I have found over my 20 years in the Arctic and northern societies, where we in Snow Change have instigated a program called Landscape Rewilding. That's very much about reality and senses of reality, where we, by working on the created landscapes and using something we call rewilding, we are able to recreate safe havens for that mind to take a rest, rebuild, and coexist with the ancient forest. Granted, these are pennies, these are small sites, but they do exist. And in many ways, they are like monasteries in the Middle Ages in Europe. They are safeguarding something that's still there, even though it has been so much destroyed elsewhere.
With the rewilding efforts, are there noticeable changes outside of the area that the rewilding is taking place? Like, are you able to see a measurable difference in the immediate vicinity? And then I guess it would get lesser as it goes out, as the rest sort of encroaches back in on it. But I think the way that I would frame it is as the rewilding encroaches on everything else. But are you able to sort of see that and measure that?
That's a very good question. Rewilding often can also be linked with restoration, so you can change these terms, but I'm just using rewilding for the sake of putting the emphasis on trusting natural cycles and succession of, for example, forest or peatlands to come back on their own terms. I guess there are two observations that might be of relevance. On some of our sites where we have been working on, the physical comeback of biodiversity has been astounding. For example, there was a peatland that had 2 bird species when the mining of peat was going on. And then now it's the home of 195 bird species today after a few years. So these are not trifles, some magical or some made up metrics. This is hard data from biologists in these stations that have monitored chick reproduction, how many birds come forwards, what kind of species have come back, and extremely rare waders and other species, as well as comebacks in numbers, with 25,000 geese landing there on their autumn migrations. And then the offshoot, which is your question really, has come to play on the human realm by demonstrating that use of indigenous and scientific knowledge in rewilding has made a comeback for many of these sites in our programs. It has led many, shall we say, new visitors to these sites, including our village school. One of the duck species that comes to our village now onto these rewilded sites is a smew in English, SMEW, and it's a beautiful duck species. And at first, the kids these are elementary school children, so they would be learning about smew in a book or maybe online Wikipedia, and they would paint smew in a watercolor. And then on the next day, they would go on to this site and actually using binoculars and others, they would see the smew for the first time in their lives and realize what they saw in theory to become reality for them, and how this wonderful bird might be there. So there's some radiating or cascading social reality that attracts then more families, more visitors, up to 1,000 people now that come to these sites a year. That's whether they consciously may not think that, but they are renewing their connections to these birds. They are enjoying these landscapes, and for the lack of better term, cleansing themselves of the past things. The second thing is that the cascading impact of a rewilding site can happen also on biological terms. So having strong centers that are, again, in the hands of nature will have spillover effects so that many nesting birds come to neighboring river systems, ponds. We have seen the comeback of mammals, wolverines, otter, pollinators, frog species and lizards and so on and so on. And these are kind of the cascading impacts of restoring a land that still, despite its degradation, retains something. And it's really by tapping into that something that I don't want to name because it's not to be named today, but it's often unseen and it can be worked with if you have traditional knowledge co-researchers who can, for example, speak with those kind of elements of nature, the unseen, and also listen what's being said by a site or a place or being that resides in a place, that we can then truly see the cascading benefits, where we understand that despite the damages that humans have caused, for example, on a forest or peatland, by if you have the right traditional owners and science working hand in hand, beautiful things can come to light. I never believed we could have a site that traps 1 million kilos of carbon a year because of our rewilding, or 195 bird species that are now constant feature of our village. And those are the powerful testimonies, some of which have been published in peer-reviewed science, to talk about the skeptics or to the skeptics, because we have to be also extremely honest. We can't say anymore about the only about the rhetorics or oh everything will be better or it will all go to hell. I don't personally believe either. I think the future is not set. There's a third way to be done. We just have to embrace it.
That's awesome. I think uh, something that I wanted to throw in a couple sort of smart ass questions, and one to sort of tie in here is we, so much of sort of the old ways is how I'll refer to it for everyone's sort of tribal roots is the old ways is either fetishized or belittled or there's always a nice category to stuff it into so that we can ignore it. And I think we've got a lot of examples, even if it is at just that 3% level of sort of living together or in harmony with our surrounding, our natural environment that we're a part of, as opposed to being masters and control and in control of it and dominating it. And so one of the sort of questions that I was thinking I could ask you specifically because of your location is Frozen 2 and Disney and how well they're contributing to this narrative by rewriting the sort of the way that we would normally view these narratives that have been passed down in history. And as my friend observed to me after Frozen 2 came out, Disney has no right to do this so well. And I don't know that they're doing it perfectly, but I did very much enjoy seeing the way that they tackled that and approached the narratives of history and I guess like the challenges of countering that narrative. So do you have any thoughts on Frozen 2 and Disney and how well they're doing between The Mandalorian and how they treat sort of indigenous groups in The Mandalorian and then nature and the spirits in Frozen 2?
Yeah, well, I was just about to say that you can't really criticize Mandalorian. So, but jokes aside, and being the devout defender of a Star Wars generation, well, these are of course fantasies and created by Hollywood and for the commercial greed. To unpack that in two ways. First of all, Frozen 2 was really well made and it was really well received in the Sami indigenous community here. One of the reasons for that was that and some of our staff in Snow Change was actually the art director and translating for those processes. One of the reasons why it was so well received was that the Sami were quite vocal towards Disney after round one, to be heard and to be part of the framing and narrative and making the movie, which I haven't seen personally, but I have seen the process of how Disney worked with the Sami kind of from the inside or at the side. And the Sami leadership was invited into the Frozen 2 premiere in Hollywood. And I think they tried their best. If you are a big evil corporation and you own everything, and then China owns you, what do you do? So there's some elements where I think they tried making it politically correct and embracing indigenous languages and storylines, and it was translated into four different Sami languages. That was a big deal. So there was some financial, physical resources that were put forward to translate the film into really, really endangered indigenous languages. But so what? I mean, it's a commodity. Children of today will probably remember it as a marker for their childhood, but in a year or in next week there will be a next film that comes along, and it's just a big machinery that has been grinding on for so long. And the trouble with that machinery is that it's not an innocent way it constructs reality. It's seeping in a lot of values, a lot of subconscious models of how women, men, young people, old people should be, what should we buy, and how we should reorganize our family and social realities. And it's really a cancer of our times. So that's why the decolonization, if you want to do that, should be to stay away or be at least very aware of all of those things daily. The barrage of things that come to you, whether it's CNN or Disney or whatever the pick of the day. The other side of the equation is that so to me these are really the nicer aspects of global capitalism, and you are there sitting in the heartland of modern day global capitalism in North America, and movies and these kind of representations of stories using movies are of course the mainstay of North American society today, and that's why they are pretty dangerous on small cultures. And the other realization is that you can't do anything about them. It's an avalanche, and in some ways you shouldn't even fight them. Rather, you should, in a way, tactically divert what you are doing away and face part of that and build firewalls to the internal reality of what then truly exists. And I picked up, maybe I misunderstood, but I picked up the hardest point of your reflection there, which I can say just that if we think about that 3% of traditional reality that might be there, or 1% or fraction of a percent, the difficulty becomes two-way on that particular discussion. On the other hand, what do you tell outsiders? And should you even discuss anything? Would it be just better off if mainstream society today has these fantasy notions of what indigenous knowledge and the voodoo side of it might be? Wouldn't it be just okay that they have their fantasies about the flying sorcerers and dragons and ogres and so on, of how things used to be, and the noble savage and Disney style Indians? Maybe that could be maybe better off than trying to then take the long road of communicating that, look, these are genuine human societies. They had their own justice and social systems, and granted, there's an element in the indigenous governance and indigenous well thriving societies that talks about the unseen and talks about the, I'm not a big fan of the word spiritual or supernatural because these are very destroyed concepts, but let's talk about the unseen for the lack of argument. And they had experts, often referred to as spiritual people, who had the capacity to communicate with that unseen. And they were highly valued. They were often either in a leadership position, or they were the key critically important advisors to leaders, and decisions on whale hunt on the west coast of Vancouver Island in the New North World, for example, were made by incredibly powerful people like these to either attract the whale or try to find out where the whales are that will give themselves to the people so that North or the macaw will last another winter. Now, how do you communicate those kind of things to present day reality? That's what I'm trying to say here. Do you try to undo the stereotypes? So you try to shoot down the 150,000 interpretations of what's shamanism, what's spirituality, what's a new age, what's a candle, what's a crystal, what's an Indian, what's a Finn, what was the epic songs all about? Who has the time for that? Or do you go and say these are cultural expressions, these are safeguarding religious practices, and that's not really true either. So my understanding today is that maybe we just need to be separate, that there are societies that are having what they have, and then there are others, and somehow we have to get along. The identity politics and the Facebooks will not solve it. We need a peace plan. We need a coexistence of a peace plan, both for Israel and the Palestinians, as just as for the First Nations and mainstream societies. And that peace plan has to be effective enough that the pain, the pressure, and the death will stop. And is it really the business of the settler society or the power to understand that profound multidimensional reality that indigenous people always talk about? Maybe not. Can we just let it be? And or vice versa, if any person wants to understand that world, why don't they go on a year-long hike to Yukon on their own, and they'll find it, or they die. And that's pretty simple as what it is. So it's not a so late in the game. To me, these are not very interesting conversations on what could be shared or where is the traded knowledges, or for the lack of better term, we need peace plans because it's a war. It's a war on the last of the last old growth. It's the war on the oceans. It's the war on climate. It's the war on Alaska. Biden says no drilling next week, little bit of drilling, and buys another political clout from that. And this is not a state of peace. This is a constant, ongoing, relentless assault on that other reality, or people that might possess the shards of the shards of the shards of that unseen reality. So why should they share anything becomes a good question. And why can't we have all across the world peace mechanisms if we are genuine in our attempt for survival as a global society? Because neither side will not disappear. I'm not a big um, fan of thinking that the settler society will go anywhere. No, they won't. The indigenous peoples won't go anywhere. They have survived everything that was coming, and they are still here. So the only viable solution, unless we go to armed conflict, and what happened in Australia 100 years ago when the indigenous Australians were hunted with weapons in Tasmania or all across Australia with a bounty on their heads, which is not a viable option. I don't think anybody wants to see Canada or Finland in flames, is to find a peace that matters, and not a land claim that propagates mining on your land. And these are the profound and hard questions that we have to think about. And maybe lastly to say that, or just to conclude by saying that, of course, if there are in the community, if there is the wise lady or the old man that wants to talk with the Pope or with Trudeau and explain that, look, I spoke with the whale or I spoke with the salmon, and they want to let you know that it's going to be fucked, or we are really in it. fine, of course, let's have it. Let's have those critically important dialogues. But it shouldn't be a service where those in need always have to get the last of the last of the last, because the sense of reality is so different, probably, and there hasn't been a good understanding. One of the BC First Nations artists from the Nujal North world, Kikein Ron Hamilton, has been saying for decades that the settler society and the indigenous peoples in BC have never really met. There has never been a single moment of joint understanding, despite all the wonderful rhetorics and dialogues and discussions on art and whatever. I don't want to go on rambling more, but these are pretty profound things to understand if we are to rebuild and come to a place of genuine understanding between very different sources of what reality is.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a guy named so first my first sort of reflection there is what John Trudell when he talks about, from 1100 on, the church had been, changing people's minds through brute force, essentially. There's a guy named Robert Williams Jr. who wrote his book, "This Savage Anxieties," and it's how the Western civilization has always been sort of founded on and defined against the savages wherever it is, and he traces it all the way back to Homer, and it's pretty interesting to see. But I think what the reason I thought of that is if the uh, activity we want to pursue is to sort of win the hearts and minds of the other people, you're up against a pretty long battle. Like there's a lot of a lot has gone on since Homer that has contributed to and reinforcing that. And one of the things Robert Williams mentions is it's so subtle that people don't even realize they view the world that way, which is how we end up with the sort of the Disneyfied savages, and it's in pop culture everywhere. And so whether or not how sort of pop culture and media change in relation to society or change society is a topic for another time, I guess. But I think I think what you're saying sounds beautiful, and I think that's really great. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions there, so we don't take up too much more of Tero's time here.
I'd just like to really say thank you, Tero. I really appreciated all your comments and insights. It's fantastic to hear your perspective and kind of ringing the bell for the urgency of what needs to be done in our project. I mean, we are up against it, and hopefully something can change. And the optimism of your rewilding project, to just take those small little pennies as you described them and let the ripples flow out from that is a great inspiration. So thank you.
Thank you. I think the hope, if there's hope, is so bastardized word by Disney as well. But let's think of what could happen still. Might lie in just these practical steps of small communities giving a hand out and saying, "Can you do the same in your place? Can we find a safe haven for the geese or the waders and do we still have children who go out to learn about the SMU and paint with watercolors and also reserving space for that innocence to happen? I think we are too much defined by everything. Why don't we let them free? Why don't we try to be as innocent as we can and make all the mistakes, but also try to do what we can? I think the solutions ultimately are all tied in with power that has been a top-down model for centuries. And what I'm really talking about is these snow change communities, for example, taking that power back and rewilding their lands so that there's a counter stream to that top-down mining company or government that comes and says ABC, and your future will be what they think it will be. So the rebuilding has all to do with power, and rebirth of your traditional institutions to the extent you can, and also practices on the land like fisheries, the women's practices, because so much of this damage has been, look at us, like this is a panel of men. There's not a single woman here. And not that this is good or bad, but it shows that the mistakes of the past should not be repeated by thinking that men are somehow better off by solving these. And it's a complex process. It's not a strategic plan, or it's not a 5-year plan like in China. It's a journey of sets of self-discoveries in a group, in a landscape where you belong. And any person could do that. I would argue that in Vancouver, not all people know when they go to Stanley Park that they are actually in the heartland of the Stalo ancient territory, with transformer sites like that one island off the Stanley Park, and the incredible human history of a 5,000, 10,000 years that goes with that stone and rock. And well, we may turn street signs into Stalo in Vancouver or Halkomelum. It doesn't really then yet convey to the ordinary person how profound that place is, or has been, and continues to be in some ways. And maybe to conclude, or just to reflect on what Bill was saying, that Canada, you sit, or people in Canada and the intellectuals and the critical discussions like these are highly needed, because you have one advantage that many other countries don't have, which is the extremely strong civil society. And these critical debates on sources of, or on reality, on rights, on indigenous struggles spill over. So it's not only in Canada, but it's also helping other places to reconceptualize their own, not to replicate, not to export your realities or your solutions, but it's to try to reframe and think how far the narrative has gone in Canada despite the huge damages. Because you are still one of the only countries in the Arctic, for example, that has co-management with the Inuits, land claim processes. Not to celebrate on this, they have a lot of faults, but they do exist. There are many parts of Russian North, Finland, where there are no land rights. There's not even a public discourse on community rights. And that's why it's not a black and white world where Canada has done this or that, or Finland hasn't. It's a complex process where we should only be listening, that's probably, and watching carefully. Those are the best humble positions we can take. And I haven't seen any other thing that works. I mean, having worked in Canada for 20 years and being an adopted member of one of your First Nations. So it's a complex process, and change takes really long time. And let's hope that the immense damage that those children paid in Kamloops and all the others who died will be the vehicle for the social change that your country will now embrace. And when Canada does that, it will spill over to Fennoscandia, Sweden, Finland, and we will follow. So it's not only a simultaneous moment in time, it's a parallel moment in time. And we may have preserved the language and some of the ancient mind, but you have taken public discourse and civil society to levels that we can only dream of. Like my brother Robert Harding here, Professor Harding, has in a way taught me. I went to his house as a young man, being 23 or whatever, and he raised me up in many academic and public discourses in Canada that I would have never even dreamed of. So I went to another university with Mr. Harding, and his deep humane approach and love for the arts, love for the theater, film, music, critical thought, and I think Snow Change wouldn't be what we are without him. So those are the kind of critically important exchanges we can have while we still have the time, and solutions that fit here can be discussed, but not to be replicated. That's the beauty of these communications that we're having, for example, right now with Byron and all of you.
Well, if I can just jump in for a second, I'm really humbled by your words, Tero, and you know you've had a profound influence on my whole way of seeing the world. And you know, I think that relates to something you said earlier about, well, and I think it's also being referred to as kind of like an internal colonization that happens, right? And I really think that's that transformation of the mind, because you connected local ecologies with a certain way of thinking and a mindset. But I really think that's the key. You know, I think that's the key. And I you know, I take your point about the, you know, the possibility of kind of an integrated of settlers learning for Indigenous people and kind of coming to a place where we can all live alongside each other and have a similar vision of the world. That's really not, that's a pipe dream, right? And that, you know, your idea about having kind of living side by side, parallel worlds, that makes a lot of sense. But I think you know, what holds the most potential is can we find ways to transform how we see the world? We don't have to be the same, right? We don't have to be the same, but I think, you know, that's key. It's something, you know, the ability to kind of take your own worldview, I'm talking about the colonized kind of way of seeing, and put that aside, you know, like what John Keats, the Romantic poet, would call negative capability, the ability to negate the self so you can truly inhabit another experience or another being or another object, right? And, you know, I think that's what we can hope for. When you took me with Arrow to the forest in the middle of the night to walk down that trail with no camping gear other than sleeping bags, I mean, that whole experience changed my way of seeing the world. It really did. It really did. And, you know, I think the work that you do through your website and through your organization, you know, making all these videos and these different papers and studies, you know, these illustrations of the work that you're doing with the carbon sinks and so on. I mean, that could be transformative. I think if you don't have to completely change, you know, convert people from the colonized mindset to more holistic Indigenous way of seeing the world. But I think if you can just make changes in that area to the way people view kind of some of the most important issues of our generation, then I think that's something that's real, that can produce real results. I believe that, tangible results. So I mean, that's the, you know, the takeaway for me from this whole discussion is I think that's the way forward, those small transformations that can occur in people. Yeah, sorry, I've probably gone on too long. But, yeah.
Well, I think the without saying anything more, but I fully agree that the physical change of a landscape has a lot of power, because it really shows the skeptics and the believers, if you want to use some terms like that, that things can elevate. You can become very different place in a short time, and your self-capacity as a community, self-esteem becomes very different. Instead of being a victim of a mining plan or natural resources pipeline, you become an agent of change, or you become an actor that physically brings back landscapes and sites, or doesn't even have to be landscapes. It can be a forest site or spawning area of a salmon or a small stream in BC. The other thing that Canada has put forward, which is pretty powerful, is the I'm thinking of my friend who we lost just a few months ago, Justice Berger, Thomas Berger. And despite the fact that so much has been said about him and his work, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline to this day represents one of the best, not the only one, but one of the best mechanisms that created that space for dialogue between indigenous peoples and the big power or the government and the companies. And what Berger, when I was speaking with Justice Berger some time ago, I was asking how, what did you yourself think would work? And he said that I listened. That's the only thing. I went to the places of the people, to the fish camps and remote communities in 1970s, and I listened what they say, and I took them without any preconceptions of and genuinely just let them speak. And I think simple acts like that can really genuinely change reality. How many of us are stuck in universities where the indigenous or the community voice doesn't get heard? How many of us are trapped in IPCC of the UN where the voice of the fisherman from Alaska is not heard? I think all of us are trapped in those things one way or the other. And that's why Justice Berger's thought of actually bringing forward evidence as it genuinely happens by the people that are impacted remains to this day a very powerful thing. And let's not forget, when he was 85, he led the creation of the largest single conservation area in North America, the Peel River Supreme Court decision and the follow-up at 85. So these are the kind of, we all need heroes, but we also need people who are humble enough to lead us and listen to recreate those transformations. And Canada, you will rest in a place that not many other countries have, because you are such a young nation. You are transforming your country in many ways through the common law system and the recent decisions on whether they are Delgamok on oral histories or land right questions or whatever the case. And that's why I said earlier that these are not trifle markers in a global society. By reframing the fact that oral histories matter, by reframing the fact that there is no pipeline on the Mackenzie Valley because of what Thomas was doing with the First Nations, by the fact that there are some steps that were taken, even though damages also happened on pipelines elsewhere, you are setting a standard, you are setting a reference point in the indigenous world and ecology where none existed before. And I would argue that you don't often see that because we are all blinded by the society where we live in. But those of us who are living outside Canada can appreciate those reference points, no matter how flawed they are, but they exist. And we can then go further and better, but without those reference points, it would be again a void. And that's some of the power of Canada. Well, let's put it in a better way. That's some of the power of Canadian civil society and academia and critical thinking that has altered many ways Arctic indigenous societies, for example, are self-thinking about their rights and realities.